Welcome, everyone. I'm Patricia Shampton, Director of Alumni Relations for the Texas X's, and we're so glad you've joined us for the August Lunchtime Lecture. And thanks again to our wonderful sponsor, Home Chef, for making this event possible for Longhorns all around the world. For those of you who still live close to the 40 acres, we hope you'll join us this football season for tailgates at the Alumni Center. Texas X's members and their guests are invited to pregame with us in the air conditioning. With big screens everywhere, great food and drink, and all the amenities, it's the best place to meet up with your group on campus before a home game. For more details, go to texasx's.org/GameDayCentral. And now on to today's lecture, which is called Folk Art Matters, the place of folk art in times of joy and times of trouble. Dr. Suzanne Seriff is a professor of instruction in the Department of Anthropology at UT's College of Liberal Arts. She is an award-winning educator and innovator who has spent over 40 years in the field as an anthropologist and museum curator. She is committed to hands-on learning, community engagement, and career mentoring, and has taught classes in anthropology, folklore, museum studies, immigration, civil rights, and Jewish studies. Please welcome Dr. Seriff.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And thank you all for inviting me to give this talk this afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here. Let's see. I'm trying to advance my slide forward. Here we go. I myself am a second generation Texas Xer and a third generation Jewish Texan. My grandparents, all four of them, came to this country around the turn of the 20th century from Eastern Europe and became merchants, peddlers, and shop owners throughout Texas. My parents both graduated from the University of Texas in the 1940s and went on to have successful careers in Houston. My dad as a geophysicist and my mom as a professional artist and art teacher. The picture on my right is my mom in a class taught by Charles Umlauf in the 1940s, a sculpture class. As she tells it, she always got the only A in whatever art class she took. But one of her professors in the 1940s, Lauren Mosley, remarked that it was a waste of time for women to get BFAs, Bachelor of Fine Arts, degrees because they would just go on and really get MRS degrees, get married, and their career as an artist would be over. Well, that didn't happen quite with my mother. Here's a picture of my mom just a couple of weeks ago, 94 years old, in her home, where I am right now, actually, in Houston, Texas, being professionally interviewed for her life story as an artist. I came back to my home state of Texas after my undergraduate degree on the East Coast to earn my PhD in folklore and anthropology here at the University of Texas, where I've taught ever since. I'm one of the lucky ones whose professional and personal life coalesce around a mutual passion: the love of a well-crafted story and the stories behind well-crafted art. Over the past 40 years, I've been fortunate to combine my love of teaching with my passion for what I would loosely call public folklore, working with communities to preserve, promote, document, display, and celebrate the arts and the stories and the traditions of everyday life. Here is famed conjunto artist Santiago Jimenez Jr. in a performance in West Texas that I led as part of an organization called Texas Folk Life Resources, where he's working in community nursing homes, schools, prisons, etc., to teach and celebrate the arts of traditional Texas Mexican conjunto music. At UT, I've developed a series of very hands-on experiential learning courses for our undergraduates in cultural anthropology, folklore, museum studies, social justice, and immigration in the Department of Anthropology and also the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. here I am just a couple of years ago, accepting an award of the President's Associates Teaching Excellence Award, where I was really delighted that they lit up the tower orange for us. I've also crafted a career as a museum curator and public folklorist, working to direct folk art exhibits and components of folklife festivals and multi-year projects. Here I am with a project that I curated for the Bullock Texas State History Museum about Galveston as an immigrant gateway into the United States. And we were very pleased that this exhibit traveled all the way to Ellis Island. And here I am in the gallery giving a particular kind of facilitated tour of the gallery, which is a tour based on dialogue and gathering the stories of the visitors that I was talking with. And here is a few of the exhibits or exhibit catalogs that I've curated over the years. So I'm convinced that growing up in Texas had a lot to do with forming the person I am today. Here I am as a child, I'm the little one, with my older sister visiting my maternal grandparents in Sweetwater, Texas, locally known as the rattlesnake capital of the world. As I said, I relish the art of a well-told tale. Texans are often accused of bragging, and while bragging might be unseemly, as I talk about in an exhibit I did for the Bullock Museum called "It Ain't Bragging If It's True," Texans have a right to brag. And many of the bragging rights that I know about came from times when I would visit my granddaddy's secondhand store in Sweetwater, Texas. And this is a picture, a painting actually, of him and his wife, who I called Grandma Honey, in front of their secondhand store called A.I. Berman's Salvage store. And this picture was painted by a young man who grew up in Sweetwater and loved to visit my grandfather's store. And he grew up to be a very well-known Texas painter. And in fact, in one year, he was named by the Texas Commission on the Art, the Texas State Painter. And what he said of my grandfather's store was that it was, quote, "a humble archives full of the past, a place where the poor found necessities, where the rich found antiques, and where an artist boy found adventure, excitement, exploration, and inspiration." So like Mondel Rogers, I've had a lifetime of adventure, excitement, exploration, and inspiration, following the stories of people who talk about the meaning behind the objects that they make and that they love. As a folklorist, I take these stories seriously. I always like to quote from a colleague of mine, Ellen Frankel, who says, "A people's tales are its memory, its conscience, the imaginative channel to its place in the world. Such tales teach each generation how to live and what to believe, whom to trust and whom to fear, when to laugh and when to cling fast to hope. All it takes," she says, "is a teller, a listener, and a moment to catch our breath." So I've come to believe that objects tell stories if you only take the time to listen to catch your breath. Much has been written, in fact, about the many ways in which traditional handmade objects tell stories. One well-known anthropologist, Barbara Babcock, said, "Objects do speak and should be heard as a significant statement of personal and cultural reflexivity." So that's been my life. My professional life and personal life has been a journey of learning how to listen to the stories objects tell about the people who make them, who use them, who play with them, who perform with them, who protest with them in their arms, and who build families and lives and careers of meaning through them. I've had the pleasure of working with traditional artists my entire life. My earliest memories are going with my parents to Mexico, and especially going to the small towns, to the markets in the town. And what I would love was to run through the market to the toy section of the market, where they sold penny toys, inexpensive little snakes in a wooden box that if you open the box, the snake would jump out and bite you, or little jumping jack figures, or skeletons, or other little toys. And I loved to listen to the people in the stalls tell about what those toys were used for, what they meant to them, what festivals they were associated with. And that got me started in my career. Here's the catalog for the It Ain't Braggin' If It's True show at the Texas State History Museum, which is a show that I did twice. I did the first year that the Bullock Texas State History Museum opened, and then I did it again 5 years later with an exhibit called It Still Ain't Braggin' If It's True, and that was about the stories that objects tell about the state of Texas and our love of Texas. So this is a picture of a particular artist that I met when I went to college and took a semester off from college and went down and lived and worked in Oaxaca, Mexico with traditional toy makers. I came back to college after that. This is Manuel Jimenez. Some of you may recognize him. He's a wood carver from Oaxaca, very well known. He was discovered, and I put that in quotes, by Nelson Rockefeller in the 1970s, as were many traditional artists throughout Mexico. And that changed the trajectory of his life. He became very well known in the United States and around the world. Now his pieces are in exhibits all over the world. But when that happened when I went down there in the 1970s, I came back, finished my undergraduate degree, wrote my undergraduate thesis about toy makers in Oaxaca. And then something fabulous happened, which was I got a 1-year grant by the Thomas J. Watson Foundation to go around the world and work with toy makers around the world. Excuse me. This is a picture of a toy making community or a toy making festival in southern India where they were selling toys. And on the right is a toy maker in Japan. You'll notice that the toys that are being sold in the picture in India are actually plastic toys from China that were sent to India. And when I was, a young kid in my early 20s, and I had gone around the world looking for handmade traditional toy makers, and I saw this, I thought, oh no, the world has come to an end. People aren't making traditional toys anymore. Only to discover that, as you can see, the toys themselves are not handmade, but the way in which they're displayed, the way in which they're sold to children at festivals, as ephemeral pieces that are bought and sold for the festival just to have fun, like we buy cotton candy and then used up or burned up or eaten up. That was still the same and continues to be the same today. And that set me on a course of trying to understand the role of traditional toys in a global society where the exchange of goods and services and materials and technology is happening instantaneously all of the time. Do we become in the world one great big fat McDonald's and that's it? Any of us who have traveled around the world know that's not the case. There are still traditional handmade arts everywhere in the world that respond to these changes. They don't live in a bubble. It's not that the world doesn't change, but our world is dynamic and always has been. So when I came back from living around the world for several years, I came to the University of Texas because it had a graduate PhD program in folklore that was only one of 3 PhD programs in the entire country. Our program had been founded by Americo Paredes and a very well-known Texas Mexican folklorist And I came here specifically because this program, this PhD program, was interested in both the arts and the texts, but also in the performance, in the way in which traditional arts are made and used in everyday life. And that was my interest. So when I first came back here, I had just been around the world working with Toymakers, and I discovered a huge collection of Mexican folk toys right here at the University of Texas that had been given to the University of Texas. It was housed at the Texas Memorial Museum because of Dr. Paredes. It was the work of a young PhD student in New York who had been studying traditional toy makers in Guanajuato, Mexico. This picture on the left is his picture from the 1960s, and he had gotten cancer and died. And his family gave the whole collection, thousands of photographs, thousands of transcribed interviews with toy makers, and thousands of toys to UT because of our PhD program in folklore. And I started working in the archives there. And this was in the 90s, and I went back to the same towns that Alexander Lazar had been working in the 60s. And I went at a festival time, the time where they were selling, these are Judas figures for Easter. And it was the most incredible experience. I went with the black and white photographs of Alexander Lazar. I found the toy makers. I took out my photographs and said, do you know any of these people? And people started crying and screaming and calling each other, come over, look at this, because they had been children in the 1960s. And now it was the 1990s, and they were grown-up toy makers in their parents' traditional business. In fact, this man that you see on the right in the color photograph is the young man that you see on the left, the same man, and he's using his father's same methods of making these paper mache figures. So I got an early experience of a longitudinal study in traditional arts. And I ended up doing my PhD right here in Texas on the work of a Texas Mexican brick maker in South Texas, from the town of Tejanos, Texas. His name was Jose Varela, and he took the clay from the factory bricks and made traditional figures out of them. These are some of the folk religious figures he made. The Virgin of Guadalupe, the angel, the Mexican hat dance. And this was the factory in which he would surreptitiously fire the figures and then take them back to his house and paint them, including this portrait bust of yours truly that he made towards the end of my work with him, when I said to him, you know, Jose, I'm writing a book about you. And he said, oh, you're writing a book about me. Well, I'm working on a portrait of you. And so he gave me this portrait, and as an exchange for the work that I was doing about him. From the very beginning of my work, after I got my PhD, I combined my love of teaching with my love of working in and for and with communities. So I started working in museums around the country and around the world. This was my first major exhibition at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it was called Recycled Reseen: Folk Art from the Global Scrap Heap. You'll recall that when I had spent the Watson year going around the world working with traditional toy makers, I found that many of them, if they were still making handmade toys, were using plastic, old Coca-Cola cans, used tires. They were using global materials from the global scrap heap to make traditional arts. So we did an exhibit. This exhibit took 10 years to curate, because we went around the world working with and filming and creating videos of traditional toy makers, not toy makers, artists, making things out of recycled scrap materials. Then I came back to Texas and created an exhibit for the Texas State History Museum. This is the one about Galveston as an immigrant port. And this was one where I specifically started what became my lifelong passion, which was to use either works of traditional artists or periods in our national history to talk about issues that are still of importance today. So this was a look at Galveston as an immigrant port as a way to encourage visitors to think about immigration today and to think about the role, why people immigrate. Are they able to immigrate? How are they treated when they first arrive in this country? What happens to them? And so that's what this exhibit did, which, as I said, went all the way to Ellis Island. And in that exhibit, which again took another 10 years, we did a lot of community work where we would go into schools and prisons and healthcare facilities and talk to people about immigration and get them to reflect. So this was a project we did with second graders in a Vietnamese American immersion program at a local elementary school, where we had them interview their parents. Their parents were all refugees from Vietnam, about their experience coming to this country. They created cartoon strips. We had a professional UT graduate student from India who was a cartoonist, and she taught them about cartoon strips. So they did strips about their parents' immigrant experiences. And those cartoons were up in the museum at the Bullock. They were up in immigration centers all over the city, and they even went to Washington, D.C. To immigration centers at our nation's capital. I also have spent a lot of time working around the state doing what I call folklore advocacy, working in prisons, nursing homes, community centers, schools, where I bring in traditional musicians, artists, dancers who talk about the way their art helps them live in a world that sometimes isn't just. And it helps them live in that world by connecting them to people that they love, by protesting things that they see as unjust, by educating people about the best practice for things. So that's this picture again of Santiago Jimenez. In 2010, I went back to the Museum of International Folk Art and became first a curator and then the director of a small space in this museum, which is the largest museum of international folk art in the world. And that space was called the Gallery of Conscience. And the Gallery of Conscience was specifically designed to use folk art that mattered, to use folk art as a way to get visitors and community members talking about issues of conscience, things that matter to all of us, about how we live in a community with other people that we don't know or like, how we get equal health care for all of us, how we deal with racism or things like that. So the Gallery of Conscience, its mission was to engage and connect different communities around human rights or social justice issues by sparking these conversations through the art itself. And we worked with artists from around the world. There is something called the International Folk Art Market, which started 19 years ago in Santa Fe, which was designed to bring artists from all over the world, traditional handmade artists, to Santa Fe for one weekend every summer to sell their work. It's the largest today, the largest international folk art market in the world. And it comes to the square where the Museum of International Folk Art is. And so, and for 8 years, I was the head of the selection committee for that international folk art market. So we partnered with the market and the museum, especially the Gallery of Conscience, to bring international artists to Santa Fe to work with Native American, Hispanic American, local artists in New Mexico around issues, and to bring those issues and those artists into the Gallery of Conscience to then bring in visitors to talk about those issues through the art. We call it an exhibit lab because it's kind of like a scientific lab where you prototype ideas and see what works and what doesn't work, and then you hone them until they really shine. So the exhibits at the Museum of International Folk Arts Gallery of Conscience are designed to be prototyped and prototyped and prototyped until they sing, until they spark those conversations that we want. So here's a aspect of the Gallery of Conscience where we put up a piece of butcher block paper and said, come on in, y'all, we need your help. We need your help to make this exhibit. There was one exhibit that we did that we said, come on in, y'all. This is an exhibit about the marketplace, buying and selling folk art, and about the ethics of the marketplace. And we want your help. So tell us what title you like. And that was what this was all about. And we would put up sticky notes that said, what do you think this exhibit is about? What do you want to know more about? Tell us your story. And then we would read those things and we would go back and start from the drawing board again and rethink. And you can see on this picture on the right, in the background, there is a photograph of a piece of folk art that we got visitors' response to, and then we go back and workshop it and try to make it better. I was guided in this work by two artists and their words, which really inspired me. One of them was the work of Lulama Silabeni, a folk artist from South Africa, who says, folk art must speak to people. That's part of what puts the folk in folk arts. We're going to talk in a minute about what I mean by folk arts, but what she means by folk arts is traditional arts that are made in a community, for a community, to be used in a community, and that speak to issues of identity and belief and values that are important in that community. The other person who inspired me is a genocide survivor from Rwanda, a woman named Janet Nikobana, who says, start from what you need, draw on what you know. And over again, and this is a piece of traditional wisdom, folk wisdom in her community. Over and over again, what I find with traditional artists is that they draw on what they know. Maybe what they know is how to weave baskets. Maybe what they know is how to make quilts. Maybe what they know is how to sing traditional songs. And they use what they know to help them get what they need, either from their families, from their communities, from the government, whatever it is. So let's take, for example, an issue that is of global importance that the artists were telling me was important, the issue of HIV and AIDS. So we start in the Gallery of Conscience with an issue that's important to everyone, let's say HIV and AIDS. We find a few pieces of traditional art that deal with that. The piece on your left is a piece by a co-op in the Winterveld in South Africa of embroidered panels that are educational panels about how to protect and prevent infection of HIV/AIDS. So if you want to die, don't use a condom, and then AIDS will be your killer. So it's like a cautionary tale. The one on the right is a series of quilt panels that you may remember from the 1980s that were put together in something called an AIDS memorial quilt. Literally millions of these 3-foot by 6-foot panels, which represent the size of a coffin, were sewn together. And the first thing that happened was that they were taken to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., to try to call attention to the president and the government to help with an issue that was not being dealt with, and that they thought was not being dealt with in terms of enough money being allocated for prevention and care. So what do I mean by folk art? This is just a quick and dirty definition from the Glenbow Art Museum that said folk art can be described as art that is of the people, for the people, by the people. Folk artists are interested in making art that tells stories about daily life or the culture of their community. You all have traditional arts in your homes, probably. Many of you have quilts that were made by your parents. You might have handmade pottery. You might crochet or knit. You might walk throughout Austin and see graffiti on the walls or murals that are painted on the walls. You might tell a joke. A knock-knock joke is a kind of traditional verbal art because it has a pattern and it's learned and it's passed on from generation to generation. Folk songs, traditional songs, songwriting, cooking. You all have favorite recipes from your parents. You all have stories about who makes the best lemon pie in your town. Those are aspects of traditional art. So then we invite folk artists from at home and abroad. The picture of the big group of artists or the artists who come every summer for the International Folk Art Market. And the ones on the left are a combination of local Native American and Hispanic New Mexican artists with the international artists who were working with us on this exhibit about AIDS. We asked the artists to share their art and some key ideas to catalyze conversation. So this is a woman named Maria Rengane who makes these panels to share with her community about AIDS. And written on one of these panels, they make panels about all kinds of things, including these days about COVID, but this one was about AIDS, and written on it were the words, "You must not be ashamed of speaking out, telling the community. When you keep quiet, you sign your own death warrant." So she was trying to do a little PSA to tell people to talk about AIDS and not be ashamed because AIDS is so taboo. All over the world, traditional artists work with medical doctors, nurses, and practitioners to get the word out. This is a group of itinerant painters in Bengal in India who work with doctors about stories about how to prevent the spread of AIDS, and they create them in traditional scroll paintings that they have found to be much more effective than a textbook of a little sperm and whatever about how to contract AIDS. When they use the traditional folk art forms, education is much more effective. Here's Maria again. Folk art helps to talk about taboos. And here you can see actually her, in the bottom right-hand corner, "You must not be ashamed to speak out." This is one of the co-op members from the basket weaving co-op that Janet Nicobana and her sister Joy founded when they came back from after the Rwandan genocide, and found thousands of women who had been orphaned or widowed or their husbands were in jail because of the genocide. And all they knew how to do, start with what you need, all they knew how to do was weave baskets, because that's what women know how to do. But what they needed was money to survive. And so they started making baskets. But several years down the road, many of these women who had been raped were now infected with HIV, and they didn't have the stamina to make a whole basket anymore. So Janet brainstormed and said, well, can you make just one coil? If you can make one coil, we can put an earring hoop in it and sell it as earrings. And that's what they did. This are some women in Swaziland whose Swaziland, like South Africa, is a place where thousands and thousands of kids are orphaned every year because their parents have died of AIDS. And these are HIV dolls that they're making to educate the public about safe practices to prevent from getting AIDS. This was an incredible story of the woman on the left. Her name was Nurse. She's not a nurse, but that's what her mom named her because she wanted her to be a nurse. And her community also makes baskets. She came to the International Folk Art Market one year and she got an infected tooth. We took her to the doctor, to the dentist. The dentist sent her home with toothbrushes and toothpaste for all of the orphans in her town, for whom the selling of the baskets provided a school, a nursing facility, a place where the kids could live, etc. And here the kids, on the day she came home with all of their toothbrushes, they took the toothpaste, they thought it was candy and they ate it all right away, but whatever. Healing after death, providing a platform to engage in conversation in the gallery, providing visitors with access to artists. This was an artist from Zimbabwe who created a little miniature scene of wood carving of a march from his community on International AIDS Day. And then we invite community members to come in, participate in the process, ask questions, leave contributions, contribute a stitch to an AIDS quilt, and see how things change. So here they are on a talkback board, contributing their own stories, creating their own little protest signs or advocacy signs of what they would want to say on a march against AIDS, leaving a note about somebody who had died of AIDS, and contributing a stitch to a community quilt. This was a public service program called Es Mejor Saber, it's better to know, because the people in New Mexico found that AIDS was so tabooed that people didn't want to get tested. But if you can get tested early enough, there are antiretroviral drugs that don't result in full-blown AIDS. So this was a campaign to get people tested earlier. And this was an artist in Peru who was speaking out against the religious and political controversies surrounding AIDS. You see on your right, he's depicting a government official and a priest, each holding a condom that's around the neck of a person who's dying of AIDS because of the controversy in the country about what to do between the church and the government about AIDS. I'm sorry, Camardino was from Mozambique. Here's a picture of the International AIDS quilt when it was on the National Mall, and you can see the thousands and thousands of panels. I don't think I have time. I was going to show you a little snippet of Lulama speaking about the importance of folk art, but I'm going to save that. These are two young folks from an LGBTQ youth center in Albuquerque who worked with us for 2 years, creating their own community quilt of people in their community who were living with HIV. These young folks didn't know people who had died of AIDS because luckily people weren't dying as much. And we worked with professional videographers to teach these young people how to interview artists about the art that they produced for our exhibit. And then they went back and worked with professional videographers to weave their own stories of living as a gay man or a gay person in New Mexico with the stories of the artists. And then we would have community nights where the artists and the young folks would play their stories, their video stories or audio stories, and talk to us about the experience. This is another short piece of one of the artist's stories. And then we go back to the gallery, take those stories, put them into the gallery, and continue to build on the gallery. And here you can see, this is Camardino's one piece, and these are all of the pieces that the community members have contributed after several months of the gallery being open. And the community response was incredible. This is a brave thing to do. I love that the gallery is always changing and is changed by the people who have responded. It is a beautiful exhibit, accessible to a museum in ways that haven't been before. The gallery is the essence of what this museum can be about. Keep this gallery. The gallery is still there, but there was a lot of controversy about this gallery by docents, by other curators, by the administrators who weren't as happy about the way the gallery looked. It wasn't as polished as some of the other galleries. And the gallery is still there. It's still called the Gallery of Conscience, but its philosophy of being a prototype, always in process, is a little bit different now. And in 2017, I came back full-time to the University of Texas. I continued to teach throughout all of this and live in Austin, but I came back to the University of Texas to start some of these hands-on experiential learning projects here at UT with undergraduates. This is one I started about 5 years ago, which is an arts and social justice program through the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies, or through LA, the Liberal Arts Program, where students intern at a museum or a social justice organization in town for 10 hours a week. And we come back together every week and talk about practical ethics, about issues of ethical reasoning, about difficult issues in our lives, workplace justice, health equity, and how the organizations they're working with deal with those questions. And we also study Jewish texts, like quotes from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, and bring in visitors every week to talk about these issues with us. A couple of years ago, in 2020, I participated with a group of faculty and students in a fabulous program that UT has called the President's Award for Global Learning, which is a study abroad program where a team from UT partners with a team from someplace else in the world to work on a problem of global significance. And we won that year. We were one of 3 teams that won, and we were headed to Kenya to work with a team of health care workers, specifically looking at the way women who had been infected with HIV were using traditional arts as ways to stay employed, to work with each other about health care services that they needed, to work on the taboo in the community against AIDS. But that was the spring of 2020, and we know what happened then. So our Kenya project was shut down. And instead, I used the 20 years that I had been working with international folk artists from around the world to work with these students to interview those artists by phone, by WhatsApp, by Zoom, by email, to ask them how they were adjusting to COVID and how they were using their arts in the face of this global pandemic. And what we found was we interviewed about 40 artists in over 20 countries. And what we found was that they were using their arts to get by financially. They were using their arts as part of community care programs. They were using their arts to educate the public about washing your hands, keeping a safe distance, wearing masks, PSA announcements, and they were using their arts to sustain themselves economically. And we created a an online virtual exhibit that has now traveled around the world. And just this past May, I want to end with this very last and fabulous piece. I did a study abroad program for the very first time with a group of signature course students from our undergraduate signature course program. A signature course is a course that every entering UT undergraduate has to take with a senior faculty member on as a way to be introduced to a small classroom and some of the gyms on campus. And for the first time, we created a signature course that was a study abroad program. And that's me in the middle. I took 15 students to Oaxaca, Mexico, and literally 40 years later, we went back to some of the same artists that I had worked with when I was an undergraduate. And when my career working with folk art and with the idea that folk art matters began. And I'm just going to leave you with this last slide. The slide on the left is me in 1981 with, you remember early on, I showed you a photograph of Manuel Jimenez. So the man in the middle is Manuel with his son Angelico. They came to Austin, Texas, where I was in graduate school, and stayed at our house. And there was an exhibit at a shop called the Charles Lewis Folk Art Shop. Some of you may remember it who have been here a long time. And you can see up here on my mantelpiece on the right, a piece of an animal that Manuel Jimenez had made and I had bought back in the 70s when I first was there as an undergraduate. So when I brought my students back this time, we went to his home. Manuel is no longer living, but this is his son, his youngest son, Isais, and his grandson, also named Isais. And I brought this piece back to give back to them because they are starting a museum in Manuel's home of Manuel's art. As I mentioned, Manuel has become internationally famous. There are lots of museum exhibits all over the world about his art. There are lots of books about him. He's listed in all of the famous folk art books. And so for me, it really was a phenomenal experience to tie together my 40+ year career as a folklorist, working on the idea that folk art matters, all centered on the University of Texas at Austin, and to have that experience from the late 1970s here in the first quarter of the 21st century. So I'm going to end there so that hopefully we'll have an opportunity for a few questions, and I would welcome them.
Thank you so that's wonderful. We have a couple of questions that have come in. So I'm just going to go off in order. So the first one is, do you find many examples of people making folk art, not for the community, but for tourists? He said he noticed this in Costa Rica a few years ago, and he was told that the government promoted it. It's a good question.
So that is a beautiful question, and I so thank you for asking it. And in fact, this trip that we took to Oaxaca was actually all focused on this shift of folk artists working, some folk artists working now totally for the tourist industry, being promoted by the government, buying and selling their arts exclusively to tourists or to museums or to collectors. And yes, I noticed that all the time. And my students were wonderful balancers for me, because I would try to say, you know, what a shame that now people are making things for tourists and not for the local market anymore. And they would constantly remind me that things are not black and white like that. And even if some objects are made for tourists, they're still in their home cooking their traditional foods, celebrating their traditional festivals, mourning their dead as they traditionally do, putting up pieces in altars to their deads, to their loved ones as they would traditionally do, while at the same time welcoming people from all over the world into their home to buy their crafts. So yes, absolutely, that happens. I think it's a much more nuanced situation than we would like to believe.
All right. And then the next one is, where can I learn more about folk arts and festivals and exhibitions in the United States?
That is a fabulous question, and I would be happy to send Roxanne a list of major folk art festivals and folk art markets. There are incredible ones. As I said, the International Folk Art Market, which meets the second weekend in July every year in Santa Fe, is the largest folk art market in the world. It's international. The Smithsonian Institution hosts an annual Folklife Festival every year around the 4th of July, 2 weekends before and after the 4th of July, which brings traditional craftsmen and also storytellers, musicians, firemen, all kinds of people who have traditional lore to the National Mall. And that's a major one. And almost every state has an arts council, and most states have folklife programs, including the state of Texas has a program, has an organization called Texas Folklife that was founded by two colleagues of mine, two PhD graduates from the University of Texas. It was founded about 50 years ago when I was in graduate school with them. They went on, like I did, not to have a fully tenure track career, but to work in the public, and they founded Texas Folklife. There's a similar program in Philadelphia called Philadelphia Folklife. There's a similar program in New York called City Lore, as well as California called Traditional Arts. Anyway, almost every state has an arts council, local festivals, and even state folklorists.
Okay, this is kind of a long question, so I'm just going to read it verbatim. So, using traditional art to communicate more digestible ideas in communities reminds me a lot of the proliferation of ideas and political messaging through memes and other content on social media and the internet over the last 3 years. Have you found that there have been similarities in the communication of these ideas, both truthful and misinformative, as there were decades ago about HIV? I'm curious to see how the early parts of this decade will be studied by future generations.
So that, again, is the most brilliant question, and I love you for asking it. Thank you so much. And in fact, it's something that I am working with a colleague to write a book about right now, specifically about the museums, libraries, history centers, Smithsonian and other organizations that are doing what's called rapid response recovery, that are collecting and documenting all of these memes, all of these objects, all of this graffiti on the walls about COVID, for future generations to study. But yes, absolutely. The idea of memes is I always start off with my students about what is folk art with a study of memes, because that's our kids' generation. Memes are it. That is what we use to communicate quick and dirty ideas about things. And yes, they do carry misinformation all the time, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. But and also they embody controversy about information, like controversy about the efficacy of vaccination, which we know is very controversial, and lots of people have different ideas that you can find all over the place on memes. So the idea of memes and Twitter is a really fruitful place, not necessarily to get the CDC facts, but to get the pulse on where people are feeling and going. And
Okay, I
it
think we have
has-
time for two more, so I'll try to get these in quickly. I'm curious to hear more about the changes in the Gallery of Conscious. Why and how did that happen? And what were the rationale and politics of it? I know that's a big question, but
Very quickly, the director of the Museum of International Folk Art, who I was working under and who had hired me, retired. A new director came along, did not have the same feelings or idea about the gallery. And as I said, there was always tension with the docents and some of the major donors and even some of the other curators about the way the gallery looked, because it was a work in progress, and intentionally so from our point of view, but it wasn't beautiful. And the rest of the museum is very beautiful and very polished. So it was politics.
yeah. This next one is, I've been impressed by the way that Novica.com has given local artists access to a world market, which has seemed to raise their status in their communities. And I wonder what your take is on that.
Yeah, Novica and many other online, Etsy and many other online resources indeed have done that. And you put your finger on a very important issue, which is while it can raise the status of individual artists, it can also be very complicated for other artists who maybe aren't as technologically savvy and don't get their stuff up and things like that. So it's not I wouldn't give a one-shot answer. I think, like all kinds of cultural heritage recognition movements, it's a mixed bag.
Okay. Super quick. Is anyone working on quilts made of the cloth masks that we wore early on in the pandemic?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful organization at the University of Michigan that has a huge quilt index, and they have a number of quilts that are completely made of masks. I know several people who have made masks and also have made quilts out of those masks.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Seriff, for speaking with us at the Lunchtime Lecture today. We really appreciate it and loved learning from you today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone that tuned in. We hope that you can join us again next month for our September virtual lecture, a surprising look at the future of energy with Dr. Michael Weber from the Cockrell School of Engineering. And mark your calendars for our October lecture on Tuesday, October 10th, which will be held in person at the Alumni Center. Those are always fun. So you can find out information for both of these events at texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. And thank you again for everyone. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.